No longer mandatory, but not abolished. Malaysia has put an end to compulsory death sentences for crimes including drug trafficking and murder. While some victims' rights groups are outraged, others say it's a long-awaited step toward banning capital punishment altogether. We'll ask whether these reforms are a win for justice. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the death penalty in Malaysia. It's a debate that resonates around the world. Is the biblical eye for an eye doctrine applicable in a modern justice system? Well, Malaysia's parliament has decided it's not quite as compatible as previously thought and has introduced laws to ban mandatory death sentences. Now, the law instead gives judges the discretion to decide appropriate punishment on a case-by-case basis. Here's a look at how it applies.
The new law would scrap the mandatory death penalty for 11 crimes including murder, drug trafficking, treason, kidnapping, and acts of terror. Malaysia is keeping a moratorium on executions since 2018. Courts will retain the option to impose the death sentence for several offences including drug trafficking, and most people on death row are charged with drug offences. The bill also replaces life imprisonment with a 30 to 40-year jail term.
I think for most part, we're on the right track. We're on a good track for Malaysia. It's a reform that has been a long time coming, and we are not the only abolitionist country in the region, right? Cambodia has not had a death penalty since its democratic government, a way to describe it. Philippines have not had the death penalty since the People's Power Revolution. They have had multiple attempts to reintroduce it, but collectively, I think their lawmakers have agreed that this is not working for us as a society. We are better off without it. So we are just joining a broader group, or at least we're moving closer to a bigger group that says abolition is the right way forward, the death penalty is not.
For the past 2 decades, the family of one death row inmate has been hoping for a miracle. They say these reforms mean their prayers just might have been answered.
My God, it feels like the moon fell upon me. The joy was immense, even though we don't know how much prison time my son has left, or when we will see him again. But we could hope. We hope it won't be long.
Let's get straight to one of the authorities supporting this reform. And joining me now from Kuala Lumpur is Ramkarpal Singh. He's the Deputy Law and Institutional Reform Minister for Malaysia. Thanks so much for being with us. I begin, if you will, by just telling us, why did you want to see this reform? And again, people are talking about abolishing the death penalty altogether in Malaysia. Would you like to see that ultimately as well?
Well, I think when it comes to total abolition of the death penalty, that has not been ruled out altogether. Whether it will happen in the future, in the near future, remains to be seen. And I think the government is still in the process of carrying out various studies and research on this, particularly to see the outcome of our latest development, where we have removed the mandatory death penalty at least. So it's something which has not been ruled out at this stage.
Right. Going back, though, to what actually led up to these reforms, for you personally, was there any case or cases in particular where you said, this is a flawed policy that needs to change for the sake of justice?
Well, before I was appointed Deputy Minister, I was a practicing lawyer. And I used to do a lot of criminal cases where the death penalty had been imposed in the past. So I've seen how it works in practice. I've seen, how it has been imposed in some cases, which I think should not have been, prescribed in the first place. So, that's the experience I personally have as a practicing or a former practicing lawyer in this field as well.
How then do you reassure the families and loved ones of victims that, argue to keep the mandatory death penalty? They don't want it at the discretion of judges because they believe this is just about fairness and justice for them.
Obviously, I've said this many times. We sympathize with the families of the victims. We are looking at ways, to sort of compensate for their loss. In fact, there is provision in our statutes which allows for families of victims to be compensated by the assailant. But I think at the end of the day, especially when it comes to violent crimes such as murder, a life loss I suppose, can never be compensated. And like I said, we cannot. We sympathize. In fact, we have met with many families in the process, in the engagement process leading up to this development, and we have certainly. We are looking into various reforms, perhaps, in the future, as to how we can sort of address their concerns as well.
Let me ask you how it will specifically then work with drug-related offenses, because the death sentence will still be allowed for certain drug-related charges, even if they don't meet that threshold for most serious crimes, which technically violates international law. How is that going to be addressed?
Well, since 1983, drug trafficking in Malaysia has been, there's only been one punishment for drug trafficking, which is the death penalty. It was mandatory, and it's no longer mandatory now, although there were some amendments in the past to allow some discretion to the courts in sentencing, but even that has been taken away altogether now. So now, as I said, when it comes to drug trafficking, for various offenses or various kinds or types of drugs, there are presumptions which operate in this country, which presume that one has been found to be a trafficker if he is in possession of a certain amount of drugs and so on. And I think, when it comes to drug trafficking, one very important consideration is that we find that a lot of these offenders are drug mules, those who have been, driven to commit the crime out of, desperation and so on. So I think, that was one of the very major considerations that were taken into account to, remove the death penalty, or at least the mandatory death penalty, certainly, when it comes to cases involving drug trafficking. Although there's no doubt that, and I think I must make it very clear, that the problem of drug trafficking in this part of the world is a very serious problem. But I don't think the death penalty is the answer.
Right. But just overall, I mean, you seem to see this as a work in progress, and there will likely be more reforms to come.
Oh, yes. I think, my ministry is committed to introducing reforms to the criminal justice system, to the prison system. We've got a problem. We have overcrowding in our prisons, and that, needs to be looked at as well. And this is also related to a certain extent to the death penalty, and all these matters are going to be looked into for the purpose of future reform.
Ramkarpal Singh, thank you so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's get more now on the debate at hand in Malaysia, particularly from those arguing in favor of mandatory death sentences. Joining me now from Kuala Lumpur is Heng Zhi Li. He's the bureau chief of the civil society movement's Malaysian Chinese Association Youth Division. And from Bangkok, Phil Robertson, Deputy Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. Thanks both so much for being with me. Heng Zhi Li, I'll start with you. I understand some victims' families are deeply hurt by this. They feel, those who killed their loved ones deserve the death penalty, and now they might not get it. But to be clear, the death penalty has not been abolished. It is still an option. So why not allow judges some discretion?
Well, actually, from our point of view, especially for the victim's family, to think that death penalty serves an effect to give the empathetic feeling to the victim's family, so that actually without death penalty, the victim's family will feel unsecure as those criminals who convicted the crimes, especially murderers or kidnappers who kill their families, they did not deserve the so-called equal punishment which their families has received. So this is the main reason why we actually ask for the mandatory death penalty to be retained. But unfortunately, since there's a need and call from the government to move forward, move towards the human rights respect, so we actually welcome the government to actually retain the death penalty in terms that the mandatory death penalty is replaced with an alternative sentence of life imprisonment.
Okay. Phil, let me just ask if that sounds reasonable to you, in the interest of the victims' families that say they are now being robbed of justice.
Well, look, we're in the 21st century. I think we were supposed to move past this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of idea of justice. The reality is that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. It has been condemned internationally. More countries are moving towards abolition than those standing pat on retaining the death penalty. And this is a good move by Malaysia to get rid of the mandatory death penalty and give the judges the opportunity to be able to assess the case, rather than having a legislative mandate sort of handcuffing them about what they must do when they have someone in a dock that's been convicted of a specific crime. This is good news for Malaysia. This is a step forward. And what we'd like to see is, of course, moving towards total abolition of the death penalty rather than just stopping here with the end of the mandatory death penalty.
Okay. Heng Zhi Li, I mean, this is the 21st century, and there is a very momentous push now in Malaysia toward abolishing the death penalty altogether. I mean, you want it to be even mandatory. What will groups like yours accept ultimately?
Yes, this question has been put forward to us, especially we represented the victim's family and also the coalition call for the retaining of the death penalty. Our point of view is that, okay, let's compare the intentional homicide cases worldwide. So we compare if, let's say, for example, in Japan, who has the lowest death penalty, lowest intentional homicide cases happen, we retain death penalty. Indonesia also, China. Of course, there are certainly Europe countries like Italy, Germany, UK, France, they abolish death penalty while maintain a low homicide case rate.
Okay.
But in contrast, we see that certain countries, for example, those countries who have abolished death penalty like El Salvador, Honduras, Venezuela, U.S. Virgin Islands, those countries who have abolished death penalty, but they have a high cases of homicide case. So we believe that maintaining death penalty is that has served some reason and purpose to keep the society peace.
Okay, you know, Phil, there is always that argument, you've heard it many times before, about the death penalty working as a deterrent. And I know many human rights organizations just say there really is no data to prove that it works. But they will argue that a fundamental problem here in the application of the death penalty comes down to corruption in the system, and that poor people in particular are far more vulnerable to suffering these sentences than the rest of the average population. What do you see there?
Well, I think that is a correct assessment, that you are, in fact, looking at a judicial systems that often disfavor the poor. The people don't have resources to hire fancy lawyers or have effective people to support them as they fight their cases. We have seen a lot of instances where people are, in fact, really not well served by the judicial system and end up being sentenced to the death penalty. And that happens not just in places like Malaysia, but it happens also in places like the United States, where Human
Right. We're
Rights
going to
Watch
talk about that
campaigns
actually
for
with our
an end to the
next
death penalty.
with our next guest. We'll be talking about that. But tell me what's specific, especially in countries that you study specifically, like Malaysia, why these people are particularly vulnerable in developing countries.
Well, I think what we see is that ultimately they are not well served by the justice system. There are certainly cases where people are guilty of the crimes that they have been found and convicted for. But I would point out, there's all this discussion about, families wanting justice for a murdered family member. But if you look at the number of cases in Malaysia, the people who are on death row, the over 1,300 people there, well over 67% are in fact convicted of drug offenses. These are offenses for which the UN states very clearly they don't meet the threshold of intentional killing that the UN has said is the only exception. For Human Rights Watch, obviously, we don't believe that the death penalty is acceptable in any circumstances, and we call for its complete abolition around the world. But, if we look at the people who are in prison in Malaysia for the death penalty, if you look at that, there's a lot of women, there's a lot of people from the Indian ethnic group, there's a lot of people who are foreigners, who are poor foreigners. So, I mean, there is quite clearly some biases here in the justice system about who gets represented ably and who is able to get off and who ultimately is held accountable and convicted.
Do you accept that, Zhi Li, that even if it is, fairly applied, there is just too much scope for unfairness to result, whereby people just that are at a disadvantaged level in society receive the hard end of these penalties?
Yeah, I partially agree to Mr. Steele's point of view that certain ethnic or groups of people they are poorly represented in the judicial system. So that's why our intention and also the purpose of retaining the death penalty is actually focused on homicide cases, not the drug trafficking or other criminal offenses which involve no loss of human life. So our focus is that the government should focus on retaining the death penalty or capital punishment for those cases involve loss of human rights. For example, like what I should put on a case like the Hong Kong murder case, Abby Toy, okay, or the recent happened, the gun murder case in Louisville, like 5 men were killed. So those people were killed brutally, and the criminal justice system to serve its purpose to retain those people and confine them in a place where they should not be allowed to release.
Okay.
And certain points, if you don't mind, I'll just share one more point, is that under the current amendment of law, Malaysian government actually allow a retrospective effect to be given, whereby the federal court is allowed to review their sentences. Yeah, this is the point where we want to argue for.
Right. Okay. That will have to be your final argument then, because we are unfortunately out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both my panelists so much for being with us. Now, as mentioned, the ethics and legality of the death penalty are a global debate, but perhaps nowhere more so than in the United States. Some express dismay that one of the world's oldest democracies maintains some of the most outdated judicial policies. So let's get more perspective now on that. And joining me from Washington is Richard Dieter. He's Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Center. Thanks so much for being with us. First, let me get your take on what's happened in Malaysia. The death penalty hasn't been abolished, but at least it's no longer mandatory. To what extent do you celebrate that, or do you think it really just has a lot further to go?
Well, I think this is a step similar to other countries in moving away from the death penalty. There actually are two reasons why a country might abolish the mandatory death penalty. And in the United States, the mandatory death penalty was blocked not because it limited the death penalty, but because it didn't respect the individual differences among human beings and cases, and made it too much a blanket without a fine-grained decision-making process for the jury. So there's various reasons that could be behind this. We at the Death Penalty Information Center don't exactly celebrate one move or the other, but we do report on what's happening. And I think this is seen as a step away from the death penalty in Malaysia. That is sort of the second reason there. You know, they supported the moratorium resolution in the UN.
Right.
They are you know, joining a much larger group of countries with this.
Yeah. I mean, it's a process. So the interesting thing, though, is that, you know, you're speaking to us from the U.S., a developed democracy. So just how much room is there, I want you to help our audience understand, you know, for miscarriages of justice to occur, you know, in states where the death penalty is more liberally applied. We were just talking about how, for example, far too often defendants are at the mercy of their defenders, and if they don't have the resources to pay for a good lawyer, for example, they suffer for it. There's also the issues of, you know, overzealous prosecutors who want to build a record of being tough on crime.
Yes, all of these issues have been debated in the U.S., but actually weren't making much of a dent in the use of the death penalty until I think science came along with DNA testing and other forms of forensic expertise that enabled us to show that some of the people on death row, not necessarily executed, some of the people were innocent, and not just one or two, but we've had 191 people freed from death row, their conviction thrown out. That's a risk that the death penalty poses, and it then calls for all these other issues to be addressed. Racial bias, prosecutors withholding evidence, defense attorneys not doing their job. All of that has to be brought up to speed if you want to avoid innocent people being executed.
Right. So speak, if you can, you know, to the victims' families, the victims' loved ones in certain cases. What do you want them to understand about the death penalty and what you see as its injustices?
Right. I certainly can't speak to how Malaysia's victims' families feel, but I can say in the U.S., here's how it's gone. We've had some terrible murders, mass murders. And what happens is that there's a division among the family members. Some want the death penalty, but many don't. And so the death penalty sets up a tension or almost a battle between family members about which way this is going to come out. The second thing is for family members is most of our crimes, most of our murders now are not given the death penalty. It's a tiny percentage. So the other families feel they're not even in the system. They're not even considered. And it causes, again, a divisiveness. Thirdly, for victims' families, I must say here in the U.S., our death penalty process is grinding to a slow halt. It takes 20 years from sentencing to execution, and that number is growing. So if you're a family member, you're in for a long, what we call a roller coaster ride if the death penalty is given. Uncertain future.
It takes 20 years, as you said, and it's also the most expensive process for taxpayers to support. Something else that's not fully comprehended by a lot of the public, that they think, why, I've heard that argument, I'm sure you have too, why should I pay to keep a killer alive in prison for the rest of his life when he could just be executed and we eliminate that cost? But actually the appeals, the legal process that goes with sending a person to the death penalty is far more expensive.
Yeah, no, if we were to do away with the appeals, we'd for sure be executing innocent people. And I don't think anybody wants that. And the costs are not just a question of, is it worth it? That money could be used for other things that do deter crimes. Better lighting in crime areas, more police officers, maybe more jobs and teachers. Money is limited. And if you spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's what it costs in the U.S., not a little bit, but hundreds of millions of dollars on the death penalty, and don't see anything coming from it in terms of deterrence, you might use that money elsewhere. That's the cost argument.
Okay. Richard Dieter, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. It's greatly appreciated. And thanks to our viewers as well. That's the conclusion of our show. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we will see you next time.